Hi, church. Welcome to another Sunday broadcast. Thank you for continuing to gather in this way, in this different way. Guidelines are changing, and we will be talking and seeing what we can do. It's not simple, so appreciate your prayers. And we have to negotiate with the school if we go back to Mamre and all those things. And so please be patient, and we appreciate your patience for those that are struggling with this sort of way of doing things. I know it's not everyone's cup of tea, but also thank you so much for being here and for engaging in this way. And thank you to those that continue to be present through the Zoom gathering afterwards. And I think those that are choosing to be present in each other's lives in and around this, whether it's just casually or doing these things together with others and in each other's homes, I think that's very wise, and I would encourage you to keep doing that. We're going to hear from Tad later and all his wisdom, and I find Tad is just sees beautiful things when he engages with Scripture, so I'm looking forward to that. Just wanted to briefly plug something. There's no progress without presence. What do I mean by that? Well, in the Old Testament, there's this theme of when God is with His people, they thrive, and when God's people turn their backs on God, they don't. His presence with them is a crucial part of them being all that God intended them to be. His presence with them, and that continues as we read on in the story of Scripture. That this wonderful God in human form, Jesus, who dies for us. For all those who turn to Him, He promises to be with them, and it's because He is with us that we can grow into whoever He wants us to be. His presence is crucial, and we talked about prayer last week, and prayer is one of those things that help us intentionally be present with the God who is wanting to be present with us and has died for us so that He can be present with us in relationship. And so prayer is a crucial aspect of that. Another crucial aspect of that is actually opening up your life and your faith to others. Absolutely, that's so crucial. I don't know if I know. I'd say it's a safe bet. I don't think I could introduce you to someone who has mature faith who couldn't identify key individuals at different stages in their life who were important for their faith, who they allowed that individual input into their life, and they were able to input in their life, and just open up to each other. And I know some of you do this, and it's wonderful. And if you know this is not really a part of your life and how your faith works itself out, I'd encourage you to take a bold step into that. And one of the ways you can do that, there's this free tool that we've made people aware of in the past. You can get a copy easy. Just ask, and I'll give you a copy. And you sit with someone who you think, this is someone who I'm going to take this risk with, and ask if we can just ask if they want to meet up and encourage each other in our faith. And that may sound super scary and awkward for some of you, but a tool like this can just help. It's like let's just go through this book together and come up with a weekly time. It's so important. It's so important that we take the step to be vulnerable, and you don't have to be vulnerable with everyone. Even Jesus chose trusted friends to be particularly vulnerable to in some ways. I think it's about is there someone? Is there one or two people or three people in of faith that you particularly are vulnerable with and open up to and share how you're going and allow them to input in your life? Because that's another way of being open to the input of God, actually, to allow others to input into your life. In the context of just an accountable relationship. So here's three people who practice that in their lives, just sharing why that's important for them. Okay. So just on the back of that, here are three people who have taken the step of just opening up their faith in their life to other people, sometime in a more one-to-one setting, sometimes in a more intimate group. and they were happy to speak on the value of that to them. And so we're going to hear from David, then Katie and Mel, just quickly some thoughts on why the step of just engaging their faith with others and being vulnerable in that sense has been important. Can I shoot to you, David?
Yeah, for sure. I guess so for me, discipleship has been just a lifeblood, I think is the best way to describe it. It's been a lifeblood of my faith. It was the starting point of my faith. From the earliest discipleship experience through my parents, really sowing those seeds. I feel like they were my first ever disciples or disciplers. And then in Sunday school, when Daryl used to teach Sunday school, that was another kind of discipleship relationship. And then I guess in early teens, a really critical discipleship relationship was with Kyle, who really helped me to take my faith more seriously. And since then, they were the really early critical relationships. But since then, discipleship has been this thing that every time I engage in it, I am reminded of the fact that it's food for my faith. Like, it's so critical, and it is the source of joy, like deep, deep joy within discipleship when I'm receiving and when I'm giving discipleship, like leading it. Just a real lifeblood from early stages to now. And it's looked very different across the life course, but it's always been so critical just to remind me of what the purpose of my faith is. Like, my faith is not meant to stay within me. It's supposed to be shared and grown by others and with others. So, that's my 2 cents.
Dave. That's so good. Thank you for sharing. Katie?
I guess by extension from that point, that it's not meant to remain with me. It's meant to, the fountain of life doesn't just, it's meant to be a conduit and to extend out towards people. That's been something that I've reflected on even in more recent years in my faith journey of just discipleship with people and approaching people one-to-one, approaching people in group settings. And I think what is most important and what most valuable to me is that I get a chance to see the fullness of Christ when I choose to step into vulnerability, when I choose to step into let people in and allow them to journey with me in a deep way. That is when I can see growth, and that is when I can see fruit. And I might not always see it, but if I reflect on the last couple of years, and I reflect on my prayer journals or whatever, I can see that that's been because people have chosen to journey with me in my faith. And there's been many across the years. But I guess more recently, I think in a group setting, confession has been a critical part of my growth in recent times. So choosing to step into to really vulnerable spaces is not a very easy thing. But that's when we see the fullness of Christ and we get to see the different perspectives of God that we wouldn't experience on our own. We need each other and we need the body. And that's what I guess I really, really love about discipleship, is that we can understand God more fully when we're journeying with God together and in deep ways.
Thank you so much, Katie. Okay, Mel, close us out.
Yeah, 3 quick things I love about discipleship. Firstly, it keeps my heart focused on what's important in life. When you meet with someone, to have an intentional conversation about the big things in life, that's just really important and is helpful. Secondly, I'm currently discipling about 6 young ladies, and it helps me pray for other people. We're often consumed by ourselves and just keeps thinking about others and praying for them. And finally, it just keeps my eyes fixed firmly on eternity. One of the young girls, she's a young teen, she's having chronic pain. She may or may not have that for the rest of her life, but it's just such a privilege to help her look to Jesus, cling to Jesus in the midst of her journey, and for both of us to know one day there will be no more tears. It's just such a wonderful encouragement. So yeah, highlight of my week, just love helping others, love Jesus more.
Well, thanks to the three of you. Can I just look? This is more than the contract said. If there is, if there are some people in our congregation who like the sound of it, but just are filled with fear, because they've always been private people. That even on the faith level, they're just not. And it will just always be awkward when you step into it. When you try. Any words of encouragement from any of you, just to that person who's listening?
Yeah.
I think it's always going to be resistance. There's always going to be resistance to journeying deeper and bearing your heart to someone. Just as you might learn in marriage, just as you might learn in friendship, you bear your heart to someone, and it's giving your heart over for them to, take that and do with it what they will. But what a privilege it is to see the depth that your faith exceeds in when you choose to do that, when you step into that. I think it's very, very central to what Jesus intended when he said, "Go and make disciples." It's his call to be family with one another. It's called to be in each other's lives, in each other's space, in each other's business in some ways, and that's frightening. It's always going to be frightening. But I think there's I mean, I can't say that it's all turned to crap and it's a waste of time. That's just not my story of my experience of discipleship. It's always going to make us grow and bear fruit in our faith, I think.
Wonderful.
I think too, it's very much a journey. It's not one person has all the answers and one person has all the problems. I feel I just walk alongside these young women, and we share, I share my heartache, I share my struggles, they share theirs as well, and we're just journeying together, and it's just such a privilege. And yeah, it's a little bit nervous, of course. You'll be a bit nervous at first, but you're helping them as well, and you're both helping each other grow closer to Jesus. So I would say, yeah, acknowledge the fear, be real about the anxiety for that, but push through it. Don't let it dominate, and the rewards will be so worth it.
Awesome. Well, thank you to the three of you. Appreciate your time, and I will see you in the flesh at some point.
Okay.
Thanks, Nate.
See you guys.
See ya.
Ciao. Bye.
I'd like to read from Matthew chapter 12, 1 to 14. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples were hungry and began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. And when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." He said to them, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry, he and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God and ate the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only the priests? Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? Yet I say to you that in this place there is one greater than the temple. But if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." Now when he had departed from there, he went into their synagogue. And behold, there was a man who had a withered hand. And they asked him, saying, Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? That they might accuse him. Then he said to them, What man is there among you who has one sheep, and if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not lay hold of it and lift it out? Of how much more value, then, is a man than a sheep? Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Then he said to the man, Stretch out your hand. And he stretched it out, and it was restored as whole as the other. Then the Pharisees went out and plotted against him, how they might destroy him. Now I'll come back to that, but first I just want to put a bit of background to it with a few comments at the beginning. In this portion of Scripture, there are two controversies, and they both relate to Sabbath keeping. What they illustrate is sometimes called legalism. Now, legalism is the idea of reducing the precepts of the Bible to rigid, narrow moral codes. It's reducing things to rigid moral, narrow codes of conduct mainly. The Pharisees considered themselves custodians of the Sabbath. They would make sure that people would rest on the Sabbath, because that was the law, that the Sabbath was to be a day of rest. And they were going to make sure, by hook or by crook, that people would rest on the Sabbath, because they interpreted the law through a physical sense, mainly outward. And so they thought that they were getting the right result if they stopped people from working or carrying burdens or labouring. Then what the Lord said was, keep the day holy, rest on the Sabbath. And on their way of thinking, the holiness would come if they rested on the Sabbath. So they built so many laws, or as it were, gave job descriptions for the Sabbath, what you could do and what you couldn't do. The reason for that was because they interpreted the law, God's law, through a physical sense, mainly outwardly. They emphasized the letter of the law at the expense of the spirit of the law. Now, Jesus tried to address that attitude in Matthew 5, chapter 5 and chapter 7. He was going to show them that there was more to keeping the law than just the outward form, just the letter. And there's one section where he says it a few times. He says, you've heard it said, you shall not kill. But I say unto you, if you are angry with your brother without just cause, if you despise him, if you call him a fool, you're open to judgment, and you are not fulfilling the law. Because the anger is the same to God as if you took a club and belted him over the head with it. Just because you didn't hit him on the head with a club and kill him doesn't mean that you fulfilled that law. You heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say unto you, if you have lusted after a woman in your heart, you have committed the act, even if you haven't outwardly done it. In other words, you haven't fulfilled the law of not committing adultery, because what was in your heart was the intent. And therefore there's more to the law than just not doing something. You didn't hit your brother, but you're not free from breaking the law. You didn't commit adultery outwardly, but you're not free because you thought of it. See, it wasn't just the outward action the law was addressing, but the inner emotions that provoke the action. Sin begins in the heart or the mind. And that attitude that is formed within comes out in actions. But first the attitude, the thoughts, the stuff within come out into actions. And God is not interested in just curbing our actions. He wants to deal with the heart from which the actions spring. Now, on the Pharisee side, you could say that they were legalistic. They had rules for everything. There were many, many rules. The reason for that could have been because they believed that you gain and maintain acceptance with God by following the rules. And the more scrupulously you follow the rules, the more meticulous you are in applying them to yourself, the more you maintain your acceptance with God. That seemed to be their way of looking at things. So they had rules. These were God-given, most of them, for sacrifices, of what type of sacrifice to give for what sin that you've committed and stuff like that. They had rules for diets, what you could eat and what you couldn't eat. They had a rule for circumcision. That was to be done on a baby on the 8th day if it's a male. And it didn't matter whether it fell on the Sabbath. It was to be done no matter what. It was a rule. And they had Sabbath keeping, especially Sabbath keeping. And their interpretation of the law allowed them to set themselves up in a special category. They were perched above everyone else and looked down upon the common sinners with disdain. In fact, they felt that if they went out through the marketplace or through the street and their robes would swish and hit or touch a sinner as they went past, they would be contaminated. So they used to pull their robe in real tight so they wouldn't get contaminated when they were out amongst the hoi polloi. They also wouldn't go to a restaurant if it had tax collectors and sinners there. Much less would they eat with them. I mean, Jesus, he dined with them and he dropped in their estimation of him as a good person. Not that he cared, because their estimation was worth nothing to him. They were also the type that if you didn't wash your hands properly, a certain ritualistic way, you would still be unclean. And Jesus had to correct them on that. He said to them, listen, you do all the washing of your cups and of your elbows and hands with a certain amount of water and a certain procedure, but that doesn't, if you don't do that, it doesn't contaminate you, because contamination doesn't come from without. It comes from within. After he said that, the disciples took him aside and said, Lord, can you explain that to us? See, they bought into that outward form of religion as much as everyone else. Can you explain what you meant by that? And Jesus was a little short there. He said, listen, are you still as dumb too, that you don't understand that if you take something from outside in It passes into your body and out of your body as a natural process. And it doesn't contaminate or do anything to you. But the contamination comes from within, and issues without. Out of the heart comes adulteries, hatred, murder, and he gives a whole list of things that come from within. But they were concentrating on the without only. And in their endeavour to interpret the law, they had a field day with the Sabbath. The Sabbath, a day of rest, bear no burden, stop the work that you normally do and keep it holy. And they laid so many laws on the people that it was hard work to actually rest. It was a hard job to rest because they were so intent on the minutiae of the law. If you had a sentence, they could make a book out of the one sentence. The Pharisees and the scribes, the lawyers, you let lawyers get hold of a paragraph and they'll write volumes on it. And so they had to have a look. What constituted a burden? How much can you carry on the Sabbath before it becomes a burden? Is putting on a wooden leg if you were, lacking part of a leg, is that carrying a burden? Oh, hang on. Or is that the leg carrying you? And they worked it out that you could only carry the weight of a dried fig. Now, either they had very big figs in those days, or else you couldn't carry anything. So a tailor, if he went out into the street and he had a needle in his lapel or in his whatever they wore, that would be unallowable. That was not allowed. Why? Because he might be tempted to do some stitching, or he was carrying a burden. So, no wooden legs. What constituted work? Was picking grain work? Apparently to them it was. So to fine-tune the law and to itemize everything you could do and you couldn't do, they lost the meaning and purpose of the law entirely. And their day of rest became just a burden and hard work. Now, Jesus didn't care for their fanciful interpretations, nor did he follow their traditions. So they constantly attacked him for his violations of their interpretation of the Sabbath law, not violating the Sabbath law. He didn't violate the law of Moses. He violated their interpretation according to them. So, we read in Matthew there, and it said, I'll go back to that now. In Matthew, it said, at the time Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples were hungry and began to pluck heads of grain to eat. And the Pharisees saw it, and they said to him, look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath. They're walking through the fields, they see grain, and the one thing that's obvious, they were hungry. Now, they weren't snacking, they were actually hungry. There was nothing open on those days, on the Sabbath. Even if McDonald's was around, they wouldn't be open. And so they see the grain and they go and pick the top of the grain and do what they have to, break it open, rub it together, blow away the chaff, and then they ate it. Well, they charged them with 4 counts of breaking their law. They were winnowing, threshing, picking, and food prep or whatever, all through just that little bit of thing that they did. Now, Jesus looked at them and he said, okay. He said to them, have you not read what David did when he was hungry? He and those who were with him? He's really not asking a question. He's saying, you probably have read it if you're Bible scholars like you're supposed to be, and you think you've got so many degrees after your names. You probably have read it, but you didn't seem to understand. Have you read when David was hungry, like his disciples were hungry, how he entered the house of God and ate the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priests? Now, David was in a situation. First of all, he was hungry like the disciples were hungry. And he didn't go to a field. He went to the house of God. He went to the tabernacle. And he met with the high priest. Why did David do that? Because back home, David was anointed to be the next king, because the current one, Saul, was going bonkers. And he was trying to kill David. And the spears and whatever else he was using, arrows or whatever, they came awfully close every now and then to David. And he thought he's either got very bad aim or else he's trying to send me a message. So David became suspicious that Saul may be out to get him. And he asked Saul's son Jonathan to find out whether his father meant him harm. Jonathan found out and told him. He said, you better get out of here because he's out to make a pincushion out of you. So David got himself together. Some men that supported him went with him and they took off. He didn't have time to make his lunch, didn't have time to take his tools of trade and his sword and whatever else he carried, and they went for their lives. He ended up at the house of God, the tabernacle. He comes and meets Ahimelech, the high priest, and he tells him a bit of a lie. He says, look, I'm out on a secret mission for Saul. I didn't have time to pack a lunch, and I and my men are very hungry. We're starving. Have you got any food in the cupboard? So Ahimelech goes to the cupboard, like Mother Hubbard, and finds that the cupboard is bare. No, there's nothing there, David, sorry. But we do have these ceremonial loaves. They used to be put into the tabernacle once a week. There was 12, one for each tribe, and they had a religious meaning, ceremonial meaning. They were kind of holy. They would stay in the tabernacle for 1 week, and on the seventh day they would be replaced with freshly baked bread. And the old ones could, according to the law, be eaten by the priests within the vicinity of the tabernacle. So David said, well, could we have 5 of those? And Ahimelech, he asked them a few questions about whether they were, clean and a few other things, that they weren't sinful. And he said, okay. So he gave him the loaves. So Jesus is more or less asking, why is it that David gets a pass for breaking the law, proper law, and my disciples don't get a pass? Why is it that David, who violated the law, doesn't get condemned by you lot, but we do? Why is it that David, who broke the proper law, didn't get condemned by God? God didn't strike him dead. Why was that overlooked? He's drawing a parallel. He went out to the temple. His disciples were in the field, hungry. Both were hungry. You're condemning us for what my disciples did, but you're not condemning David, or are you? No, they're not condemning David. They wouldn't be game accusing him of violating the law If they did, the people might violate them because they held David in higher esteem. And he says, why wasn't he condemned? Well, there's a simple explanation. Because human need trumps religious ritual. Human need is more important than religious ceremony. God cares more about human need than about some ritual that you're into. Human need trumps religious ritual. You won't find that in the Bible, that sort of verse, but you will find the intent of that. And he quotes them. He says, okay, have you never read, and he quotes a passage from Hosea. He says, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. If you understood what that meant, you would not condemn the guiltless. You seem to have an attitude that is focused on the outside and the law, and you ignore the needs of people. And God doesn't. He says, I would rather have mercy than sacrifice from you. Your idea is that if you can fulfill the law, you may get mercy when it suits us. But God says, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. And then he quotes them that bit about the priests in the temple, that they work on the Sabbath. Why do they get a pass? Because God is available to people at all times. The idea of the Sabbath was to be devoted to God, to worship God, to do what is spiritual. Get yourself into, take stock of your life and your relationship with God. And you're only concerned with sacrifice. So, why do the priests get a pass? Because God is open at all time. God doesn't sit in the temple with his diary and look at it and says, oh, it's Thursday. Only one more day and I'm out of here. No, he's there all the time. And he wants people to come to him all the time. He also said to them, or he implied to them, you're offended for God, what my disciples did. You're offended that the law was broken. Do you realize that I am the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath? You were the recipients of the Sabbath. I'm the giver of the Sabbath. I'm the Lord of the Sabbath. Do you think that I might know whether an offense has been committed? Really, they hadn't thought things through. Then they move on, the next chapter, or the next little portion, they move from the grain fields, and it says into their synagogue. Now, it could have been their synagogue. They were of the same mind as the people that were out there in the grain fields accusing them. And he says, behold, there was a man who had a withered hand, and they asked him, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath that they may accuse him? They were trying to trap him into being merciful. That's almost humorous. They were trying to trap him. Of course God's not humorous. God is merciful. They were humorous that they couldn't see it. And they're trying to trap him. So he comes out with another story, and it really gets to the heart of it. Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? And he says to them, what man among you who has one sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath will not lift it out? They seem to be implying that, yes, we'd lift a sheep out, and we have, but if a man falls into a pit, well, that's his tough luck. He'll have to wait until the Sabbath finishes. He fell in. Well, I'd like to help you, but it is the Sabbath and I can't work. You'll have to wait until tomorrow and hope you don't get eaten by a wild animal. I can get you a sandwich. Oh, no, I can't. It's the Sabbath. Sorry, you'll just have to hang on. That's their attitude. And he said, how much more value than a sheep is a man? How much more value then is a man than a sheep? Therefore, in answer to your question, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. And he got them because they probably have saved sheep themselves. So he caught them out. Then he said, just before they, in one of the other Gospels, it says he looked around at them and they did not respond. They didn't acknowledge that fact. They looked at him with anger. And he was angry at them for their hardness of heart. He was annoyed that people could be so hard-hearted. So he looked around at them. And he was mad at the way they responded. Jesus was angry at their hardness of heart, one of the Gospels says. Pharisees get mad at violations. God gets mad at people's hardness of heart that care more about violations than about people. Their mindset was exalting rules and traditions and not caring for the hungry and the crippled. They can eat another day, not on the Sabbath. Don't come in here and get healed today, go away. Now there was a man who was, I don't know what a withered hand looks like, but I'm sure it's like a claw. Not very good. An impediment for him to work and support himself, support his family. It would be very awkward to have this dried up stump or whatever it is. And Jesus shows mercy and he says, come here. Now, stretch out your hand. And the man stretched out his hand, and in front of them all, it was restored whole. I don't know, if I saw a miracle like that, where this claw-like thing turned into a proper hand right in front of their eyes, the Bible would have said they jumped up and down and hooted and hallelujah. But no, it says they went out and plotted how to get rid of him. They were interested in the letter of the law at the expense of the spirit of the law. They weren't interested in mercy, they were interested in sacrifice. And if you look back in that chapter, Jesus says in the previous chapter, he offers rest to the people. He says, come unto me, all you who labour, and I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am lowly of heart, and you'll find rest for your souls. And it's as if, they probably heard that too, it's as if they said, we don't want your rest. We don't need your rest. We have our own rest. And what was their rest? Rules and regulations. They were resting in what they perceived to be the way to win God's favour. They didn't want his rest, and they didn't want to care for others. They were only interested in looking at the law. Now, just to finish, the Sabbath is still a bit of a controversy amongst Christians. Certain Christians, they make a big deal of it. Not only is it worshipful on a Saturday and worshipping on a Sunday, one group says that that's not acceptable. So let's just look at it this way and finish up. Why don't we keep the Sabbath like the Jews did? It was such a big deal for them. Because the covenant with Israel is not the same covenant that we have with God. In the old covenant that they had, it was a physical covenant with God. They rested on a particular day, so they thought they were gaining something. We have a spiritual covenant with God, so it has a spiritual meaning. We don't rest in a day once a week. We rest in the person and work of Jesus Christ on the cross every day. He said it was finished, the work he came to do. And we rest 365 days a year in the person of Jesus Christ. And even on leap years we rest in it. In Hebrews 4:3 he says, the writer, "For we who believe enter that rest." And that was God's intent all along. Colossians 2:16 to 17. This is what it says there, and this is interesting once you apply it to the Old Testament. "So let no one judge you in food or in drink, or regarding a festival, or a new moon, or Sabbaths, which are a shadow of things to come, but the substance is of Christ." Those things in the Old Testament, the physical things that were done, were a shadow of things to come. But Christ is the substance. And when the substance comes, you don't go back to the shadow. The shadow was just indicative of what the substance may be. But it didn't tell you everything. It doesn't fill in everything, but it gives you an idea. What God gave to them in the Old Testament was visual aids. But Christ was the substance. He is the substance. If you look at some of the things, circumcision, that was applied to the male so that they were in covenant with God. And anyone who wasn't circumcised at that time was not of that tribe of Israel. But in the new covenant, true circumcision is of the heart by the Spirit. Romans 2:25. The circumcision that God was after was always what was inside, not just a physical thing. And the Sabbath rest was what? In a day? No, it was in a person. And it was always God's intent that that's what he would come to. The new covenant is not the old covenant. Not the physical, it's a spiritual thing. And sacrifices, we don't offer sacrifices. Romans 12:1 and 2, present your bodies, not an animal. Present your bodies as living sacrifices. So we who believe enter into his rest, which was available to us from the beginning of the earth. I'll finish there.
Storm Surely as the sun will rise, you'll come to us, certain as your word is yours. You'll come, let your glory fall as you respond.